The gunshots echoed through the canyon, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crimson Montana sky as Samuel Blackett spurred his horse harder, desperate to outrun the bandits who'd ambushed his wagon train. The year was 1871, and the frontier offered little mercy to those who couldn't keep up with its savage pace. Samuel's lungs burned as he reached his abandoned wagon 3 miles from where the attack had scattered the caravan. His companions had either escaped or perished. He couldn't know which. But he'd been forced to circle back for the supplies he couldn't survive without. Twilight painted long shadows across the rugged landscape as he dismounted, his boots landing with a soft thud on the parched earth. That's when he heard it, a sound so out of place in this desolate stretch that it froze him mid-stride. A whimper. Small and frightened, coming from beneath his wagon. Samuel crouched down, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. He peered into the darkness beneath the wooden frame and found himself staring into the wide, tear-streaked eyes of a young woman, no more than 20 years old, her dress torn and dusty, her honey-colored hair tangled with twigs and desert brush. "Don't hurt me," she whispered, pressing herself further against the wagon axle. "I ain't gonna hurt you, miss." Samuel slowly removed his hat, hoping the gesture might make him appear less threatening. "What are you doing under my wagon?" The young woman's lip trembled as she answered. "Hiding. The men who attacked, they..." Her voice broke. "Mama's gone. They shot her when she tried to protect me." Something in Samuel's chest tightened as he extended his hand toward her. "Not anymore," he said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." Her name was Catherine Davis, he learned, as he coaxed her from beneath the wagon with gentle words and the promise of safety. Her mother and she had been traveling to Idaho where her uncle had settled, hoping for a fresh start after her father's death from tuberculosis 6 months prior. They'd joined the wagon train in Missouri, 2 women alone seeking the promise of the West. "I'm heading north to my claim near Helena," Samuel told her as he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and offered her a tin cup of coffee from his meager supplies. "You can come with me until we find your uncle or another safe place for you." Catherine stared into the dancing flames of the small fire he'd built. "I don't even know if Uncle William is still alive. The last letter came 8 months ago." Samuel watched her hands tremble around the cup. At 28, he'd seen his share of tragedy, lost his own parents to a cholera outbreak when he was 16, fought in the war, drifted westward seeking something he couldn't name. But he'd never felt as responsible for another soul as he did in this moment. "First light, we'll head north," he said. "Stay close to the mountains where there's water and cover. Those bandits are likely still searching for survivors to silence." He didn't need to explain further. The fate of witnesses to such attacks was well understood in these territories. That night, Catherine slept in the wagon while Samuel kept watch outside, his rifle across his knees, listening to every sound the wilderness offered up to the star-studded sky. He found himself straining to hear her breathing, irrationally afraid that she might slip away like morning mist if he didn't remain vigilant. Dawn broke with the distant howl of a wolf pack and the soft nickering of his horse, Drifter. Samuel stirred the coals of their fire and set coffee to boil before gently tapping on the wagon's wooden side. "Miss Davis? Sun's up. We should move soon." Catherine emerged looking both better and worse than the night before. She'd cleaned her face with water from his canteen, but in the unforgiving light of day, the bruise on her cheekbones stood out starkly against her pale skin. And the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of nightmares rather than rest. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not leaving me." As Samuel helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly covered hers. "I wouldn't do that." They traveled north for 3 days, keeping to less traveled routes. Samuel taught Catherine how to handle his spare revolver, a decision that raised her eyebrows but which she didn't question after he explained the realities of frontier life. "My pa believed women should know how to shoot," Samuel explained, as he adjusted her grip on the weapon. Said it was only fair, considering the dangers. My mother would have disagreed, Catherine said with a sad smile. She believed a lady should always appear helpless even when she wasn't. Her expression darkened. That belief didn't save her. On the fourth night, as they camped in a sheltered draw with juniper trees providing both firewood and coverage, Catherine finally spoke of what happened during the attack. They came from nowhere, she said, her voice steady but her eyes fixed on something distant. 5 men, maybe 6. They shot the lead wagon driver first, then it was chaos. People screaming, horses bolting. Mama pulled me down beneath our wagon, told me to run toward the trees when she gave the signal. Her hands twisted in her skirt. But when she tried to create a distraction, one of them saw her. He didn't even hesitate, just fired. Samuel didn't speak, giving her the space to continue or stop as she needed. I didn't run, she whispered. I crawled under wagons, staying hidden while they took what they wanted. When it was quiet, I just kept going, not knowing where, until I found yours. She finally looked at him. Why did you come back? To your wagon, I mean. My maps, Samuel answered honestly. And my father's Bible. Couldn't leave those behind. You risked your life for sentimental items? Some things are worth the risk, he said, then added more quietly. I'm glad I did. The air between them seemed to change then, charged with something neither was ready to name. As days stretched into a week, they fell into a rhythm. Samuel hunting for their meals, Catherine proving surprisingly adept at preparing what he brought back. They shared stories around evening fires, Samuel of his time in the war, of his dream to build something lasting on his claim. Catherine of growing up in St. Louis, of her talent for drawing that her practical mother had discouraged. She wanted me to find a suitable husband, Catherine explained one evening as she sketched Samuel's profile in the small journal he'd given her from his pack. Someone established, respectable. Not some dirt-poor homesteader with calloused hands and foolish dreams, Samuel asked with a half-smile. Catherine's pencil paused. I never cared much for respectable men. They always seemed confined, like birds who'd forgotten they had wings. The following day, they encountered another traveler, an older man with a mule train heading toward the mining operations. He eyed them with suspicion until Samuel explained they were married, a lie that slipped easily from his lips but caused Catherine's cheeks to flush pink. Newlyweds, Samuel elaborated, feeling strangely protective. Heading to my claim, north of Helena. Dangerous country for a pretty wife, the man commented, his gaze lingering too long on Catherine. She's tougher than she looks, Samuel responded, his hand casually resting near his holster. And I aim to keep her safe. Later, as they made camp several miles from the encounter, Catherine confronted him. Why did you tell him we were married? Samuel busied himself with the fire. Single women traveling with unrelated men invite certain assumptions. Assumptions that can turn dangerous. So it was for my protection? Her voice held a note he couldn't quite interpret. Yes, he said, then met her eyes. And because it was simpler than explaining the truth. Which is what exactly? She pressed. That you found me hiding under your wagon and decided to become my protector? That you're taking me to a homestead I've never seen because I have nowhere else to go? That I couldn't leave you behind, Samuel said softly. And now I can't imagine continuing without you. The confession hung in the air between them, unexpected and raw. Catherine's breath caught visibly, and for a moment, Samuel feared he'd crossed a boundary that would shatter the fragile connection they'd built. Then she moved toward him, her steps deliberate until she stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. I keep waiting to feel grief, she whispered, for my mother, for my old life. But all I feel is relief that I'm here, with you. Her hand trembled as she raised it to his face. "Does that make me terrible?" Samuel covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek. "It makes you alive." When their lips met, it felt inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Her mouth was soft beneath his, hesitant at first, then yielding with a sigh that seemed to carry away the last barriers between them. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. "I've never," she breathed against his mouth. "We don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted, her eyes meeting his with certainty. "But not until it's proper." Samuel pressed his forehead to hers, his breath ragged. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? Would you want that? A life with me?" The vulnerability in her question made his heart ache. "Catherine Davis," he said solemnly, "if you'll have me, I'll build you a home and fill it with everything you never knew you wanted." They reached Helena 2 days later, and Samuel insisted on doing things right. He purchased a simple gold band from the assayer's office with some of the money he'd been saving for supplies. They found the circuit preacher, who raised an eyebrow at their haste, but performed the ceremony in the town's small church with 2 strangers as witnesses. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced when the brief service concluded. Samuel cupped Catherine's face in his hands as if she were made of porcelain. "Are you sure?" he whispered, giving her one last chance to change her mind. Her answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press her lips to his, sealing their unlikely union with a kiss that promised both tenderness and passion. Their wedding night was spent in a small room above the general store, the only accommodation the growing town could offer. Samuel's hands shook as he unbuttoned Catherine's borrowed dress. The shopkeeper's wife had insisted on lending her something more fitting for a bride than her travel-worn garments. "You're trembling," Catherine observed, her own nervousness evident in the slight catch of her voice. "I'm afraid," Samuel admitted, pressing a kiss to her shoulder as the dress slipped away. "Afraid that I'll wake tomorrow and find this was all a dream." "Not a dream," she assured him, guiding his calloused palm to rest over her heart. "Feel that? I'm real. This is real." Their coming together was slow, Reverend Samuel showing a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. Catherine discovering a boldness she hadn't known she possessed. In the aftermath, tangled in cheap cotton sheets with moonlight painting silver stripes across their skin, Samuel traced the curve of her hip with wondering fingers. "I never thought I'd find something worth fighting for out here," he murmured against her hair. "Then you appeared under my wagon like some kind of miracle." Catherine pressed her lips to the scar that ran along his collarbone, a remnant of the war he rarely spoke about. "Perhaps we found each other because we both needed saving." The journey to Samuel's claim took another 3 days. As they crested the final ridge, Catherine gasped at the view spread before them, a valley cradled by mountains, a creek winding silver through meadows dotted with wildflowers. And there, beside a stand of ponderosa pines, the beginnings of a cabin, its half-finished walls promising shelter and permanence. "It's not much," Samuel said, suddenly anxious about what she would think of this remote place he'd chosen to build his future. "But the soil's good for growing. There's game in the hills, and the creek never runs dry, even in August." Catherine's eyes shone as she surveyed what would become their home. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. After a lifetime in the confines of a city, the vastness of this landscape felt like freedom. The weeks that followed tested them both. Samuel worked from dawn until dusk to complete the cabin before winter set in, while Catherine learned to cook over an open fire, to identify edible plants, to keep watch for the threats that lurked in the wilderness. They argued sometimes about the placement of the stove, about whether to prioritize finishing the root cellar or the stable, about Catherine's insistence on helping with the heavy work despite Samuel's protests. "You'll hurt yourself," he'd grumble when he found her attempting to move logs or dig post holes. "And you'll work yourself to death if I don't help," she'd counter, refusing to be relegated to traditionally feminine tasks. Their first real fight came when Catherine shot a deer that had wandered into their clearing, a clean kill that dropped the animal instantly, but sent Samuel running from the half-finished barn, gun drawn, thinking they were under attack. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his face pale with the fear that had gripped him at the sound of the shot. "I was thinking we needed meat," Catherine replied, standing her ground, "and that you've been teaching me to shoot for a reason. Not to go hunting alone. Anything could happen out here, bears, wolves, hostile riders." "I wasn't hunting. It walked right into our yard," she interrupted. "And I'm not helpless, Samuel. I won't live in fear, jumping at every shadow. That's no way to build a life." They butchered the deer in tense silence. But that night, as they lay in their makeshift bed, a platform of pine logs covered with a straw-stuffed mattress, Samuel pulled her close. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You're right. I can't protect you from everything, and I shouldn't try to." Catherine turned in his arms, her fingers tracing the worry lines that had formed between his brows. "I understand your fear. I feel it too, when you're out of my sight for too long. But we have to trust each other's strength as well as our own." By the time the first snow fell in early November, the cabin was finished, a sturdy structure with a stone fireplace, 2 rooms separated by a curtain Catherine had sewn from flour sacks, and windows crafted from oiled paper that let in a surprising amount of light. They'd also completed a small barn where Drifter and the mule they'd purchased in Helena sheltered from the elements. Winter brought its own rhythms and challenges. They were snowed in for nearly 2 weeks in December, the drifts piling higher than the windowsills. Samuel taught Catherine to play checkers using buttons and coins as pieces. She taught him to dance in the small space before the fire, humming the waltzes she remembered from her youth in St. Louis. On Christmas morning, Samuel presented Catherine with a gift he'd been working on in secret, a proper drawing table positioned near the brightest window, complete with compartments for the charcoal sticks and paper he'd purchased on their last trip to town. "So you never have to stop creating," he explained, as she ran her hands over the smooth pine surface, speechless with emotion. Catherine's gift to him was a hand-sewn quilt made from scraps of fabric she'd been collecting and hiding for months, pieces of his old shirts too worn to mend, remnants from the dress she'd been wearing when they met, even a square cut from the wagon cover that had sheltered her on that fateful day. "So we never forget how we began," she said, as she wrapped it around his shoulders. January brought a blizzard that threatened to collapse the barn roof under the weight of wet snow. They worked side by side for hours, clearing the heavy accumulation, their faces numb with cold, but their determination unwavering. "We make a good team," Samuel observed as they finally retreated to the warmth of the cabin, exhausted but triumphant. "We always have," Catherine replied, helping him remove his frozen boots, "from the very beginning." February brought fever, Catherine burning with it for 3 terrifying days, while Samuel melted snow for cool compresses and prayed more fervently than he had since his parents died. When her fever finally broke, he wept with relief, his head bowed over their clasped hands. "Don't leave me," he begged, his voice raw. "I can't do this without you." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, her voice weak but her eyes clear for the first time in days. March arrived with the first signs of spring birdsong returning to the valley, the creek swelling with snowmelt, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil in the garden plot they'd prepared the previous fall. As Catherine tended to the seedlings she'd started indoors, she felt the first flutter of movement in her abdomen, a sensation so subtle she might have imagined it if it hadn't been accompanied by a knowledge that seemed to settle in her bones. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Catherine took Samuel's hand and placed it low on her still flat stomach. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, watching his face carefully. I believe we're going to have a child." Samuel went completely still. his eyes widening as he looked from her face to where his hand rested against her. "A baby?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make it untrue. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it," she said. "I've missed my monthly time twice now, and I feel different. Not unwell, just changed." The smile that broke across Samuel's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He gathered her into his arms with a gentleness that contrasted with the exuberant laugh that escaped him. "A child," he repeated, wonder filling his voice. "Our child." The months that followed were filled with preparations, Samuel expanding the cabin to include a proper bedroom for themselves and a small nursery, Catherine sewing tiny garments from the softest fabrics she could find. They made the journey to Helena once to purchase supplies they couldn't produce themselves, and once to consult the town's only doctor, who confirmed what they already knew and pronounced both mother and child to be in excellent health. "You've done well for yourselves," the doctor commented, noting Catherine's robust appearance despite the rigors of frontier life. "Many women in your condition struggle out here, especially first-time mothers." "I have a good husband," Catherine replied simply, reaching for Samuel's hand. "And I have a wife who's stronger than she looks," Samuel added, the pride in his voice unmistakable. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat made Catherine's advancing pregnancy more difficult, and a drought threatened their garden until Samuel devised an irrigation system from the creek. But it also brought visits from neighbors who had gradually settled within riding distance of their homestead, the Wilsons, with their 3 boisterous sons, the elderly Pattersons who brought Catherine jams and advice on childbirth, the young Norwegian couple who barely spoke English, but whose friendship transcended language barriers. "I never expected to find community here," Catherine confessed one evening as they waved goodbye to the Wilsons' departing wagon. "I thought we would be alone." "The frontier brings people together," Samuel observed. "Out here, you can't afford to hold on to old grudges or prejudices. You need each other too much." As autumn approached and Catherine's time grew near, Samuel's anxiety increased. The nearest midwife was a full day's ride away, and the unpredictable weather of the mountains meant that help might not reach them in time if complications arose. "Perhaps we should go stay in Helena until after the birth," he suggested as they lay in bed one night, his hand gently caressing the prominent swell of her abdomen. Catherine considered this, understanding his fear, but also feeling a deep conviction that their child should be born in the home they had built together. "Mrs. Patterson has delivered 12 babies," she reminded him, "and she's only an hour away if the weather holds. I want our child to be born here, Samuel, where we found each other, where we made our life." Samuel pressed a kiss to her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "I just want you both safe." "We will be," she assured him with more confidence than she truly felt. "This is where we belong." The baby, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, arrived on a crisp October morning with the efficiency and determination that would later become her hallmark personality. Mrs. Patterson barely made it to the cabin in time, having been summoned by Samuel at the first signs of labor. The birth was difficult but uncomplicated, and when Samuel was finally allowed into the bedroom, the sight of Catherine holding their tiny daughter against her breast brought him to his knees beside the bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, one finger gently stroking the downy dark hair that covered the infant's head. "Just like her mother." "She has your eyes," Catherine observed, though in truth the baby's eyes were the unfocused blue of all newborns. "And your stubborn chin." As winter settled once more over their valley, the Blackett family established new rhythms around the needs of their daughter. Catherine learned to sketch with one hand while holding Sarah with the other. Samuel built a cradle that could be rocked with a foot while his hands were occupied with other tasks. They took turns walking the floor during colicky nights, whispering stories and promises to the tiny girl who had completed their family in ways they hadn't known they needed. On the anniversary of the day, they met a date they had decided to celebrate, rather than mourn. Samuel took Catherine to the highest point of their property, where a vista opened up to reveal miles of untamed Montana territory. Sarah, bundled against the spring chill, slept contentedly in her mother's arms. "I've been thinking," Samuel said as they gazed out over the land, "about that day under the wagon. About what you lost and what we found." Catherine leaned against his side, her free arm slipping around his waist. "What have you been thinking?" "That sometimes the worst days of our lives lead us to the best ones," he said, turning to face her. "That I'm grateful every day for the chance encounter that brought you to me, even while I mourn the circumstances that made it happen." "My mother would have liked you," Catherine said softly. "Despite her preference for respectable men, she would have seen how happy you've made me." Samuel brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as gentle as it had been that first night by the fire. "Are you happy?" Catherine looked down at their sleeping daughter, then back to the man who had offered her safety when she had nothing, who had built her a home when she was lost, who had given her love when she needed it most. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "You found me at my lowest moment and said not anymore, and you've kept that promise every day since." Samuel pulled her and Sarah into a careful embrace, his arms encircling the two people who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with purpose and joy. Against all odds, in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, they had created something precious, a family forged from tragedy, strengthened by challenge and bound together by a love that had begun with a chance encounter beneath a wagon wheel. "Not anymore," he repeated, the words that had once been a promise, now a celebration of all they had overcome together. "Not ever again."